Just as Sarah's world begins to unravel, she uncovers a hidden necklace, proof of her husband's affair with their maid. But what starts as betrayal quickly spirals into a deadly confrontation, leaving Sarah holding the bloody glass that ends one. Mark and Sarah Wilson are the quintessential power couple. Mark, in his mid-40s, is a successful businessman, his days filled with boardroom meetings and the bustle of the corporate world. Sarah, a refined woman in her early 40s, exudes grace and poise. She manages the home with precision, ensuring that everything, from their public image to their private affairs, remains flawless. Mark is the kind of man who commands attention. His charming smile, silver-streaked hair, and well-tailored suits make him the envy of his peers. He's often the center of attention at social gatherings, his voice carrying just the right mix of authority and charisma. Sarah, on the other hand, is quieter, but her presence is no less striking. She's beautiful in a classic sense, with soft features and an air of sophistication that turns heads at every event. Together, they are the embodiment of success, a couple who seems to have it all. But beneath this surface of perfection, something is amiss. Sarah had noticed a change in Mark over the past few months. It was subtle at first. The way he would leave for work earlier than usual or come home unexpectedly late. Then, there were the business trips that seemed to last just a day too long. He had always been busy with work. But now, there was something different about his absence. He seemed distracted, distant even when they were together. The loving husband she had known for years was slowly becoming a stranger. At first, Sarah dismissed her worries as paranoia. After all, Mark had always been a faithful, devoted partner. They had built a life together that many could only dream of. They attended charity events, hosted lavish dinner parties, and were regulars at the most exclusive gatherings in town. But despite the glittering appearances, a creeping doubt began to gnaw at Sarah's heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. Mark stared down at his phone, scrolling through emails his food barely touched. Sarah watched him, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Is everything okay at work?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Mark glanced up, offering her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just the usual. Things are getting a bit hectic with the new project coming up." Sarah nodded, but her gut told her otherwise. She had heard that excuse before, too many times recently. He had been using work as a shield, hiding behind late meetings and last-minute deadlines. But Sarah wasn't the type of woman to confront him outright. Not yet. She knew that if she was going to accuse him of anything, she needed proof. Her suspicions deepened one Saturday evening. They were invited to a corporate gala hosted by one of Mark's business partners. It was a grand event, filled with the city's elite. Business moguls, politicians, and socialites all mingling under chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Sarah dressed in her finest gown, a deep emerald that complemented her fair skin and dark hair. Mark, as always, looked impeccable in his tuxedo. They arrived at the event arm in arm, the perfect couple, as everyone would say. But as the evening progressed, Sarah noticed something strange. Mark excused himself far too early, claiming he had a splitting headache. Sarah had seen him handle far more stressful situations without so much as a wince. Yet tonight, he couldn't even stay through dinner. Something wasn't right. She watched as he slipped away, the excuse hanging in the air like a thick fog. Sarah stayed behind, making polite conversation with other guests, but her mind was elsewhere. An unsettling thought formed in her head. What if Mark wasn't really sick? What if he was lying to her? As the night dragged on, Sarah found herself unable to enjoy the party. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could he be seeing someone else? The thought seemed ridiculous. Mark had always been loyal, hadn't he? Yet, There was a nagging suspicion that wouldn't let go. She decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. A few days later, while Mark was at work, Sarah returned home earlier than expected after a charity meeting. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed something unusual. The house was quiet, but there was a car parked just outside, one she didn't recognize. Her heart skipped a beat, her palms suddenly damp with sweat. She parked the car and entered the house quietly, her senses on high alert. The house seemed empty at first, but then she heard faint sounds coming from the living room. Her pulse quickened as she tiptoed toward the source of the noise. Peeking through the slightly ajar door, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There, standing close together, were Mark and Eliza, their maid. Eliza was a young woman in her mid-20s, hired just a few months ago. She was attractive, with a curvaceous figure and a certain confidence that bordered on flirtation. Sarah had always felt a bit uneasy about her presence, but she never imagined that her husband would fall into temptation. Mark's hand rested on Eliza's lower back, their bodies too close for it to be innocent. They weren't saying much, but the way they looked at each other spoke volumes. It was intimate, too intimate. Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. Her husband was having an affair with the maid. The room seemed to spin as Sarah's world crumbled around her. She felt as though she had been punched in the gut, her mind struggling to process the betrayal she was witnessing. She stumbled back from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to get out of there before they saw her. She needed to think. Over the next few days, Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. How could this be happening? How could Mark, the man she had trusted for so many years, betray her like this, and with their maid no less? It was a slap in the face, a blow to her pride that left her reeling. Mark's behavior became more suspicious. He was spending more time at home, finding excuses to avoid work functions or social gatherings. Eliza was always around, her seductive clothing flaunting her curves as if taunting Sarah with every glance. Sarah's hatred for the young maid grew with each passing day, and the tension in the house became unbearable. She couldn't confront Mark, not yet. She needed to bide her time, to find a way to make him confess. But the weight of the secret was crushing her, and Sarah knew she wouldn't be able to keep it together for much longer. The perfect life they had built was unraveling, and Sarah could feel it slipping through her fingers. Something had to give. Sarah's once serene world had crumbled into chaos, and she now found herself living with a husband she could no longer trust, and a maid whose very presence felt like a violation of her home. The air between them grew thick with unspoken accusations and suspicion. Yet, Sarah couldn't bring herself to confront Mark directly, not yet. She was not ready for the inevitable eruption that would follow. Instead, she buried her anger deep inside, knowing it was only a matter of time before it exploded. In the following weeks, Sarah started to observe their interactions more closely. She noticed the subtle glances, the secretive smiles, the way Mark seemed to linger in the kitchen whenever Eliza was around. The betrayal was evident in every small gesture, and it infuriated her. Mark was playing the perfect role of a husband during family gatherings and social events, but in the privacy of their home, Sarah saw through his facade. Every time he made an excuse to stay home, her stomach twisted into knots, wondering what he and Eliza were doing while she was out. She began to avoid her friends, dreading the questions that would come if her mask of perfection slipped. Her self-confidence plummeted. She was in her 40s, past the prime of her youth, while Eliza, with her young and voluptuous body, seemed to flaunt everything Sarah had once had. As days passed, Sarah's mind became consumed with one obsessive thought. How could I let this happen? She had been a devoted wife, had given Mark everything, her loyalty, her love, her youth, and yet he betrayed her for this maid who wore skirts too short and tops too tight. Every moment in the house felt suffocating, the walls of their perfect life closing in around her. One afternoon, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She had to know the truth, even if it destroyed her. While Mark was at work, she searched through his things. She found nothing in his phone, no texts, no incriminating emails. He was careful, too careful. But as she rifled through his desk drawer, her hand brushed against something she hadn't seen before, a small, ornate box. Inside, she found a necklace. It wasn't something Sarah would wear. Too young, too flashy. The kind of jewelry a man would give to his lover. Her heart clenched as the realization hit her. This was for Eliza. Sarah felt dizzy, her world spinning out of control. There it was, undeniable proof that her husband was having an affair with their maid. She stood frozen, staring at the necklace, her hands trembling. A part of her wanted to smash it, to scream, to throw it in Mark's face. But another part of her felt paralyzed, unable to confront the ugly truth she had unearthed. That evening, when Mark came home, Sarah acted as though nothing was wrong. She cooked dinner, made polite conversation, all while the betrayal simmered beneath the surface. Mark, oblivious to her discovery, continued his charade. Eliza served them both, her face as serene as ever, her body moving gracefully as she poured wine and cleared plates. Sarah's eyes followed her every move, hating her more with each passing second. After dinner, Sarah excused herself and went upstairs to the bedroom. She sat on the bed, staring at herself in the mirror. Her once vibrant features now seemed tired, worn down by the stress of the past few months. She felt old, used, discarded. The thought of Mark touching Eliza, of sharing their bed with her, made Sarah's skin crawl. She imagined them together, his hands on Eliza's young, supple body, and the image was too much to bear. One evening, Mark was invited to another corporate event, a high-profile party hosted by one of his business associates. It was the kind of event that Sarah would have usually attended by his side, dressed in her finest, with a smile on her face. But tonight, she declined. She told Mark she wasn't feeling well and that he should go alone. In truth, Sarah had other plans. Mark kissed her on the cheek before he left, and Sarah watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She waited, counting the minutes until she was sure he was gone. Then, she went downstairs. The house was eerily quiet. Eliza was in the kitchen, washing dishes, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment. Eliza was humming softly to herself, her back turned, completely oblivious to the storm brewing behind her. Sarah's heart raced as anger boiled within her, the rage she had been holding inside for so long finally coming to the surface. She couldn't hold it back any longer. "Eliza," Sarah said, her voice cold and sharp. Eliza turned, startled. "Mrs. Wilson, I didn't hear you." Before she could finish her sentence, Sarah lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her into the living room. Eliza cried out, struggling to free herself. But Sarah was fueled by a fury she had never felt before. She shoved Eliza toward the couch, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "How long?" Sarah spat, her voice trembling with rage. "How long have you been sleeping with my husband?" Eliza's eyes widened in shock and she stammered, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Sarah screamed, her hands shaking. "I've seen the way you look at him. I found the necklace. How long?" "Eliza." Tears welled up in Eliza's eyes as she looked down at the floor, too ashamed to meet Sarah's gaze. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Sarah's heart shattered into a million pieces at those words. She had suspected the affair, but hearing it confirmed was like a knife twisting in her chest. She couldn't believe this was happening, that her life had come to this moment, standing in her living room, confronting the woman who had stolen her husband. "You disgust me," Sarah hissed, her voice shaking with fury. "I trusted you. I let you into my home, and this is how you repay me." Eliza sobbed, her shoulders shaking as she covered her face with her hands. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Wilson. I never meant to hurt you." But Sarah couldn't hear her apologies. All she could see was the betrayal, the lies, the deceit. In a blind rage, she grabbed the nearest object, a glass vase that had been sitting on the coffee table, and hurled it against the wall. It shattered, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Eliza stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah's hands were trembling as she picked up a jagged piece of glass from the floor. Her mind was racing, her vision blurred by tears. She wasn't thinking clearly anymore. She just wanted the pain to stop, the betrayal to end. Before she knew what she was doing, Sarah lunged at Eliza, the shard of glass in her hand. Eliza screamed, but it was too late. Sarah plunged the glass into her stomach, the force of her anger driving the blade deep. Blood gushed from the wound, soaking Eliza's shirt as she crumpled to the floor. Sarah stood over her, panting, her hands covered in blood. She stared at the lifeless body of the maid, her mind numb with shock. What had she done? She hadn't meant for this to happen. She hadn't meant to kill her. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. Eliza was dead. Mark walked into the house at that very moment, his face pale as he saw the horrific scene before him. He stood frozen, unable to comprehend the sight of his wife, standing over Eliza's body, her hands shaking, her eyes wild with terror. "Sarah, what have you done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. But Sarah couldn't answer. She simply stared at the blood-soaked floor, the reality of her actions crashing down around her. The room was deathly silent except for Sarah's shallow breathing and the steady drip of blood pooling beneath Eliza's lifeless body. Mark stood at the doorway, his face a mask of horror as he took in the scene. For a moment, neither of them moved. The weight of what had happened seemed too heavy, too unreal. The perfect world they had once lived in had collapsed in the span of minutes. Sarah, still clutching the bloodied shard of glass, felt as though she was standing outside her own body. Everything was a blur. The rage, the blood, the shock in Mark's eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could she explain what she had just done? How could she explain that the betrayal, the humiliation, and the jealousy had driven her to this point of no return? Mark finally broke the silence, his voice low and trembling. "Sarah, put the glass down." His words were soft, almost pleading, as if he was speaking to a wild animal. Slowly, mechanically, Sarah loosened her grip on the shard and let it fall to the floor with a dull clatter. Her hands, stained with Eliza's blood, began to tremble violently, and she collapsed onto her knees beside the body. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the crimson stain that was spreading across the carpet, the vivid proof of her impulsive, violent act. "I didn't mean to." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "It just happened. I didn't mean to kill her." Mark took a hesitant step forward, his face pale and ashen. He looked down at Eliza, then back at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear, sorrow, and something else. Something Sarah couldn't quite place. Disgust? Hatred? We need to call the police," Mark stammered, running a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to make sense of the situation. "We can't just leave her here." At the mention of the police, Sarah's panic spiked. The gravity of the situation hit her like a freight train. If they called the authorities, she would be arrested, charged with murder. Her entire life would be ruined. She would lose everything: her home, her reputation, her freedom. And for what? A moment of blind rage, a betrayal that had shattered her world. "No, Mark," Sarah cried, scrambling to her feet. "You can't. Please, you have to help me. We can't let anyone know. We can make this go away." Somehow, desperation dripped from her words as she grabbed his arm, her eyes wild with fear. But Mark pulled away, shaking his head. "Sarah, this is a crime. You killed her. We can't cover this up." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she shook her head furiously. "I didn't mean to. You don't understand. I lost control. I was so angry." And her voice trailed off as the weight of her actions pressed down on her. There was no excusing what she had done, whether it was intentional or not. She had taken a life. Mark stared at her for a long moment, his expression hardening. "I understand you were angry," he said coldly, "but that doesn't change the fact that Eliza's dead, Sarah. This isn't something we can fix." The sirens wailed in the distance as Mark made the call. Sarah sat in the living room, her eyes vacant, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had tried to reason with him, to make him see that this could be their secret, but Mark wouldn't listen. His loyalty had crumbled the moment he saw the blood. He had always been about appearances, and now that the illusion of their perfect life was shattered, he was ready to let her face the consequences alone. As the police arrived, the once grand and elegant home turned into a crime scene. Officers moved through the house with purpose, securing the area and taking photographs of the blood-stained living room. Sarah sat in stunned silence, unable to process the flurry of activity around her. Her entire world had crumbled to dust. An officer approached her, handcuffs glinting in the dim light. "Sarah Wilson, you are under arrest for the murder of Eliza Morales. You have the right to remain silent." The words barely registered as Sarah was pulled to her feet and led toward the door. Her mind was numb, her body moving as if on autopilot. As they passed Mark, she searched his face for some sign of empathy, some glimmer of the love they had once shared. But all she saw was cold detachment. He stood with his arms crossed, his eyes hard and distant. The man she had loved for so many years was gone, replaced by a stranger who no longer cared about her fate. The flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the driveway as Sarah was placed into the back of the vehicle. She glanced up at the house, the home she had built, the life she had worked so hard to maintain. Now, it was just a shell, a monument to the lies and betrayals that had festered within its walls. As the car pulled away, Sarah's mind raced with fragmented memories of how it had all gone so wrong. How had she ended up here? In the back of a police car, her hands cuffed, her life in ruins? She had once been the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, living in the perfect house with the perfect husband. And now, it was all gone. The trial was swift. The media pounced on the scandal, dubbing it the maid murder and plastering Sarah's face across every headline. The court proceedings were grueling, with the prosecution painting Sarah as a jealous, rage-filled wife who had brutally murdered her husband's young lover in a fit of blind fury. Mark testified against her, recounting the events of that night with a cold detachment that cut Sarah to the core. In the end, the jury found her guilty of second-degree murder. Sarah was sentenced to 25 years in prison, her once glamorous life reduced to a small, gray cell. The days passed in a blur of monotony, each one blending into the next. She had plenty of time to reflect on what had happened, to think about the choices she had made that led her to this point. But no amount of reflection could change the past. No amount of regret could bring Eliza back or repair the shattered remains of her life.